current content idea system for daily ideation. In general, I try to come up with something that on a daily basis would provide me with new ideas whenever I record videos. Since I batch record videos, it would be nice to just have all of these ideas recorded in some way or another. Since over time, as the day continues and as your mind is awake, my mind at least tends to generate some ideas, sometimes with my rational involvement, sometimes more without my rational involvement. Many of these ideas are also maybe not already thought out ideas that actually could be something I could potentially turn into a content idea, but many of these maybe can be turned into content ideas if you dig deeper and see where this thought actually comes from. And then you realize something, and this could be maybe an idea. Because what I think of this mostly is sharing the things I already have in my head. And if they are worth sharing, then I might potentially share them. For this reason now, I came up with the following system. First of all, I record these small nuggets of ideas in either my task manager, or I record them basically in my personal notes already, since this is something I have to record anyway. Whenever something that would be a personal note could be something that is shared, then I don't track it in my personal notes, but instead I already take these ideas and put them basically into my tasks. Then in my tasks I have two lists, one for short ideas and one for long ideas. I don't know if this distinction in the long term makes sense, since this idea, for example, was originally a short, but now it already turned into a longer video, since I now, during making this, realized that it might be better in a long video. Nevertheless, the format itself kind of dictates the format of the idea. So therefore, maybe constraining yourself to maybe a short video, so maybe up to 60 seconds for a certain period of time, and then doing longer videos or the other way around might still be beneficial, because otherwise at least I find myself talking way too long all the time, maybe recording something for 2 hours that also could have been said in less than 2 hours. And I also then, of course, have the opportunity cost of not having the other ideas that occurred during a given day recorded in the fresh state of these ideas. If you have an idea and you record it 2 years from the origination of this idea, so 2 years in time obviously, then the problem is that you don't get the benefit of this idea being fresh, and therefore you also being anticipatory, you could say, of the idea itself. So as I have an idea and I then record it more or less immediately, or within a day, or maybe within a week, then I am still basically living, breathing this idea, you could say. Now, on the one hand side, I have basically this task list. I also have a content management system in Notion, but since Notion is still a little bit too latent, so it still takes a little bit longer to record these ideas otherwisely in Notion if I switch to Notion. Therefore, I don't record these ideas in Notion yet. Another problem is this. Whenever I search for something in Notion, so I use the search function, then what happens is that currently I have basically only things in Notion that are things that are already existing. But ideas and content ideas are things that are not already existing. I mean, they are existing as ideas, but they are not existing as files. So if I search for something and then all of these ideas also turn up, then I might just pollute my searches and make the search itself a little bit more difficult, or the finding itself a little bit more difficult. So now returning to the content idea system. It's basically recording my thoughts on the one hand side, but then there are also these other things that can be repeated. So there are these different sources, and I wanted to have something that I could look up if I needed inspiration that was not other content basically. So I came up with the idea of making just a task that I would then pull up here, and whenever I then am recording here, then I can just have these, and I can just think in my mind of all of these different things without writing them down. So here is the current state of this of this list. That's basically the second one. I don't know if there will be a third one. Let's see if I need one. So the content idea system as of currently is as follows. These are just random tasks basically that I have it just organized as tasks, and these are just potential inspirations from what I already am doing. Basically, that's the main part. I am living my life anyway, and whenever something, an idea, hits a threshold, a certain threshold of being interesting, shareable, then I just say, okay, this is something I can collect, as already stated before. So therefore, the first one is go over all my quotes and explain them. What I see as a quote, as a personal quote, is things in life are often complex. Structures are often complex. We barely understand anything about how we work, for example, or how our brain works. But nevertheless, we can basically sum up entire books with sentences. Now, the shorter a sentence is, or in general a message is, the higher the likely interpretations. But now, we still, I think, need these very short messages, even though some people might think something totally or associate something totally different with a short sentence. But if we have a short sentence like life is short, for example, life is short is obvious, it's a truism. It's not really a truism, but it's also a perspective. It all simultaneously is kind of it implies basically all the meanings, the sub-meanings of the words, but then puts them together in a very nice way. And if you therefore say life is short to somebody, then what you actually mean is that you don't have infinite time. Life is short, so it's already shortened, because the bigger sentence would be that you don't have infinite time. Life is short. But then it includes a variety of other pre-assumptions already. So therefore, the simple quote that life is short is something that makes sense, and that therefore, within a very short time frame, within seconds basically, is able to transmit an idea either to somebody else, another entity, or to yourself again. So therefore, I have come up also with quotes for myself which haven't existed yet. And I don't want to quote myself as the originator of these ideas, but often I just think it makes sense, this sentence structure, in order to myself remind of maybe an entire decision process, of an entire thought process. And if I therefore go over these quotes, I am not only accessing the quote itself, but the quote itself is already basically maybe a 20-minute video, a 60-minute video, because I maybe have put in hours, maybe hundreds of hours of thinking over the years into this specific quote. Therefore, this is something that is usually a good video idea if I still have something, if I have changed something, and so on and so forth. Then, for certain channels, it could be useful to look up content. So maybe there are certain lists on the internet, for example. If you are maybe doing comedy, then maybe you could get, or you could access basically common sayings, for example. Or you could also try to cover comedy, for example. Or if you are a musical artist, then you could just go, that usually covers Ed Sheeran, let's say, then you could just go over Ed Sheeran's records. So the second thing is kind of a looking up of lists that already exist, but are not content ideas, but you turn them into your content, basically. Then go through Take and talk about the publishable topics. What I see as Take is my personal notes, basically. So I have, as I go through time, as my physical body and also my mind goes through time, I record notes, usually about decision processes, but also about random thoughts I have and why these thoughts might be there, and so on and so forth. And so over time, I recorded these. I record this at multiple times a day, and I call it takes because I like the word and it's only 4 letters, and therefore it is a short word. And since I also write it often, this also is, or turns out usually to be, a benefit. So now, out of this list, basically this infinite list, it's an infinite book basically about my life, depending on how long I live, I of course can just take out certain fragments of these and talk about these. If they are shareable, worth sharing, That's one filter. And the second filter might be if it's publishable. So if you have something that is very private, you might not want to talk about this. Or if you have something that involves you and your current location, for example, and you don't want to compromise your current location. Compromises more on the security side speaking, but maybe you don't want to be doxxed. If you are maybe very famous, for example, if you are, let's say, Brad Pitt doesn't want to randomly just give out his address in an Instagram post, for example, his address in an Instagram post. So for this reason, many of these ideas might not be shareable. Another interesting topic is the following, that once you record an idea in any digital process, then basically all the national security services can read this. But that's a topic for another video maybe. But it is at this point in time also plainly obvious that many of these services can just access all of your data. Here is an example of one of these takes I then can also turn into something. So this is written in German, but I try to translate it now. So one of the problems of taking the ideas and publishing them, or publishing them to a certain extent, and since I do know the idea, since I already recorded it, or I just recorded it as of today, here is the idea. Out of all the different things you think, out of now all the different things, you publish a few, and the rest you record in your private notes. If you then access your private notes, I think it doesn't make sense to record duplicates. So for this reason, you write an idea either in your private notes, or you have an idea and publish it, and therefore it's in your public notes, you could say. So in your video ideas notes, for example. So what happens now, I think, is if you take the best ideas and put them out of your private notes, then your private notes are basically just the worst ideas. So this is a selection process. And if you then don't have a system for refreshing your public notes, if then these ideas, for example, are videos, then at least as of currently, you cannot just skip through a video and get all the content without linearly listening or watching the video. For this reason now, an idea like this that I just recorded, that I then usually don't duplicate record in my personal notes, because it would just be a duplicate, it's just living on one of my channels. Do I usually watch my channels? Sometimes, yes, but if I now go through OneNote, which I use for note-taking usually, and then I want to search for something on OneNote with this search function, then the problem is that all of these ideas are not there. They only would be there if they also would be in language written in OneNote. But since maybe these ideas are not written in OneNote, this means that they are basically not accessible. So therefore, I distort my perception of what happened in the past in terms of ideas, in terms of decision processes, and so on and so forth, if I just outsource these to basically the shareable ideas, and by this make the private ideas less interesting, seem less interesting, or make my life seem less high level, you could say, because these ideas are lower level. And this is an idea I had in my private notes. I could have now taken this idea out and made a video about this, which I'm currently kind of doing, or at least including it in this video. But then I again wouldn't have it in my private notes. And that's kind of a thing I still haven't figured out how to solve this properly. Now, the next point is talk about previous purchases or the purchase strategy. So a purchase is an item you need in your life. Since you need it in your life and you don't just randomly probably buy items, because items cost something usually, and because you usually have to exchange either your time or your money over time for interest or income, this now means, or wage or income, or wage or interest, this now means that your money is valuable. And so therefore the unit of money you use in order to buy this thing is also worth because it's basically connected to your time. Since you value your time, you value your money, therefore you also value the things you purchase. Therefore, the things you purchase are actually quite interesting in terms, because there is a lot of decision making behind this process, because it is worth something to you, at least at this point in time. If you therefore take the things you recently bought, this might just be a very good indicator of what you recently thought about, had to think about, and therefore it, I think, makes sense to some degree at least, out of all the things you then recently bought, to pick the things that again are shareable and are not compromising your privacy too much, and to then talk about these things. Next one is remake old ideas better. If this is a graph, and I based my video strategy mostly on the fact that over time, my skill of presentation would go up over time. Maybe like this, maybe like this, probably more like this, because at some point in time I just cannot get that much better without seeming super weird. Because human communication is kind of the standard, and if I talk in 3 times the speed, potentially, theoretically, if this would be possible, then of course I can theoretically record these videos and then slow them down and so on and so forth. But maybe there is just a cap, and probably there is just a cap on how good my presentation skills can get. So if I have reached those, this is nice. But as I am still along on this journey, basically, as my life goes on, and I continue at a certain frequency to make videos, then my skills will get better. And therefore, at any point in time, if I have a video idea and I turn it into a video, and then I am basically it's the next day, then there is already a difference, a delta in what I would be able to present this. So basically, the implementation of this video idea as a video would already be better. So therefore, remaking old videos better is always a good option, because it basically improves the implementation of this one idea. You could therefore take any idea you ever had or any video you ever made and make it slightly better by re-recording it. Whether you then leave the old one published or not published is of course of your choice. Go through blogs and talk about interesting things on these blogs. So there are a few blogs I usually read, and therefore these are already curated ideas you could potentially talk about. You could potentially just cite the source, therefore get rid of the citing the source, is this idea your idea problem, by, for example, talking about this is something I read today on The Verge. So therefore it is current, you also cited the source already. Maybe you could just cite the author, why not, if you have time. If it's not a video that is only 10 seconds, then maybe this might make more sense. And therefore, this is another curated source of ideas, similar to your mind, for example, that updates and refreshes over time, and you just can collect the best ideas, as already stated, and then just use the best ideas with now a higher amplitude, indicating a better idea, basically, a higher level of greatness of the idea, and then take a few of these ideas and turn them into a video by adding something onto this. Of course, you don't want to one-to-one just read an article from the internet, but you also maybe could, for example, read just Wikipedia articles, and maybe this would be a good idea for a channel. A channel, maybe it would be not. For some kinds of content, there might also be generators. Let's say you want to make a channel about random facts. Maybe there are random fact generators on the internet. And similar to this, there might be other things. Like, what if you had a language channel and every day you want to talk about vocabulary? Then what you could do is you could just generate a random English word, for example, and then teach this German or English, this English word, to all of the people who follow you daily, basically, and these people along with you would learn a daily new word, but the source of the word is actually a generator. Now, I already talked about the take, so the genre, and this is now usually how I record things. So throughout basically time, whenever I have an idea I need to talk about, I need to analyze or discuss with myself, basically I just record them in here. Whenever I realize that this is too big and I need maybe also a different format for this, and this needs to live on a separate page, then I take something that is very big in terms of what is required, maybe in time, but also in terms of space. Then I take one of these and I create a separate page in one of my other notebooks. For example, if I talk about finance for like, I don't know, many lines in terms of the document, then it might make sense to turn this actually into a separate document, which then means that the take document, so the journal document, is a little bit less in file size and therefore might be more accessible and also faster and so on and so forth. So this might make additional sense in terms of optimizing the performance of your daily take or journal. If you have a Word document, for example, that's for 10 years and you have a lot of pictures in there, then this might be just a little bit slow in terms of loading. So for this reason, I take, whenever something hits this threshold, and I take it out. And I also obviously can talk about these other notes I have from my life, which are not basically just this take I just described. Go through camera roll and discuss recent media. So in terms of now camera roll, I think this is a fairly interesting topic. A few years ago, smartphones, for example, were not that good. But then smartphones became better, and what I realized is this. My phone and my camera are also basically time dependent. If I, for example, shop for something and I just want to record, okay, I'm at H&M and this is how I look in this shirt. I will never have the chance again to test this shirt again, maybe in a similar circumstance, but if I go to H&M again, but then I do have to go to H&M again. But I could also document this process now of me wearing this shirt. And then at every point in time in the future where I ask myself this question again, whether I would look good potentially in this shirt, I can't just access this information by taking a picture of it. So therefore the picture now already has a timestamp on it, which is very nice. Often it also has an additional meta information, like the location, for example, like the visual information on the picture. Like maybe in the background you see H&M in New York, for example. So therefore you also kind of know where you were at that point in time. So basically, the more pictures you take of your life, the more you know what you actually did. Now, of course, this has some limitations. You don't want to take pictures while sleeping, for example, because that would decrease the efficiency of sleeping. But whenever you have an important decision to make or an important note to make, then I think the visual notes, so there are basically, the journal is more the text note, but the more pictures you take out of your life, the more documented your life is visually. Of course, you could also take video, but video currently in terms of file storage and also accessing these is just again a linear format that has to be consumed with a certain linear time. A picture can be viewed basically in a second or maybe less a second. You can also view multiple pictures at once. It's something that only requires the visual consumption, but not the visual consumption over time so much. So basically, viewing pictures is almost infinitely small in time, whereas viewing and watching and listening to audio and video is not. It requires time to access the information. So for this reason, I think also the combination makes sense. If you have your take already, then you can just take now with Windows Link, with Windows Phone Link. This is now a little bit better, at least on Windows and on Android. You can just take these camera rolls. So basically you take your camera roll, and then whenever something hits a threshold where it is that interesting, that you also then have these screenshots in your timeline on the take or on the journal, and therefore decrease the speed at which you are able to access this again, because OneNote is just not that fast at this point in time. And also if you just have a lot of pictures in there, it needs to load all of these pictures. And maybe becomes megabytes, maybe gigabytes of data to access, and therefore also to load. So therefore, whenever something hits a threshold, you can also insert it into your text notes usually, and therefore have a combination of these two worlds without having to deal with video. Of course, you can also take a video if this is better, but what I found is usually taking pictures or a series of pictures is just the better option, because file restrictions. Restrictions in terms of file storage are just too big as of now for this to be something that is very valuable usually. So what you can do now, as also a source of ideas is to just go through your camera roll and just see if there is something interesting. Like this shirt at H&M, I actually considered buying, but then it turned out it didn't fit my body shape. So for this reason, maybe if you have a similar body shape, then it might also not fit you. And by the way, this is the standard shirt of H&M, so therefore this video might also have some longevity to it. And this would be basically a video idea, for example. Additionally, what I also do, so I record basically my thoughts in my journal. I record my visual environment, so basically what I see. So what I think is what I record in the take. What I see, I can record with a camera. And what I see over time, I could potentially record with video, but usually I don't because of file restrictions. And also I have a policy to either publish something, a video usually. So I only record video if I can publish this video. I also have a small selection of private videos I use basically for personal documentation, which is basically the additional layer of video to the visual layer and to the text-based layer, and both are visual obviously. And I do not have an audio layer, because if I have an audio layer, this again would require linear consumption over time, which then might mean you have to listen to yourself over and over. And I found it is usually a better idea to generate new ideas and to keep working on new stuff compared to listening to you and to old versions of or previous iterations of things you did. So for this reason, I now have this covered. But what I also can do is I have two digital screens, and these two digital screens are my notebook and the monitors attached to it and my phones. So what I can do is I can very easily store the visual information I am concentrated on my screen if I'm looking at the screen, but just screenshotting the screen. And since you do many things on these devices these days, it doesn't really make sense to take a picture of the thing you are doing right now, which is always your notebook. But what actually is on the notebook can be recorded digitally with a screenshot, maybe also with a screen recording if, again, it's video. For this reason, I not only have my camera roll, but also my screenshot roll, and I save all of these over time. Of course, the files get larger and larger. Maybe you have to subdivide this into years, into months, and so on, into months. And the same is true for your notebook. Now, obviously, again, there might be compromised data on this. If you record something like a login details or what you used to log into a certain site and you take a screenshot of it, then this might not turn out to be beneficial, or you have to then secure these files again. But as things you could potentially share, this again acts as a source of inspiration, just using the different sensory informational inputs and trying to figure out how to record them properly. So what I also have in here, but it is more specific in terms of photography, I did a little bit of photography in the past. So a picture is also kind of a decision process, and the picture itself is the result of this decision, also selection process. So if you then have a picture of a tree, you actually were in this place probably. So maybe you also traveled to this place. Maybe you then thought about how to make this picture. Maybe this picture is only the 1 out of 10 you choose to then show to someone else, or you choose to store and you deleted all the other ones. Therefore, each picture might have an interesting story. So for this reason, you could also maybe potentially, which I may potentially will in the future, make a channel where you talk about the pictures you took, and this could be interesting stories. Recent work strategy changes and discussions. So of course, this could also be a private strategy changes and discussions. And again, it's just documenting basically what you think. So what you think can be sometimes summarized or can sometimes crystallize in a new strategy, for example, or a new iteration of something, a new process, a new workflow of doing something. And therefore, as you change things, so for example, let's say you have, this is the week, and the week has 7 days, and then what you do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then what you can do is you can make a schedule for the ideal week. And whenever you change the schedule, this probably has a lot of decisions behind it. So therefore, if you now change something, you can document for yourself this change on video, and therefore you can kind of justify making a video about something like a little change by simultaneously also letting others access this and by potentially also monetizing this in the future. So for this reason, maybe something like a small change in your weekly or daily schedule could be something that is worth sharing, because the things you repeat over and over are obviously very important because they are repeated over and over and therefore lead to compounding effects and also different outcomes over time. Historic and currently used Windows apps. Now this is very specific. It applies to basically all the things you use, you could say. So Windows and also Android and also in general services, and Android and Windows is, you could argue, such a program or service or application are basically just a subset of the things you use. So all the things you use can be divided, I think, into services and also physical things. So physical things are usually called products, but of course a service can also be called a product. So out of these two things, service and products, what you can very easily do is you can also again document the decision process. Whenever you purchase something like a physical thing, then obviously we already talked about this, but if you consistently use, then it's basically, so another distinction would be to have something you buy once, a single time, and then also something you buy or access again and again. So it's basically a subscription. That's what I'm trying to say. Windows is basically a subscription, but you access this subscription usually by buying a device, maybe all 5 years, for example, and it is already implemented or included in the device. With Office 365, it's even more obvious you buy a subscription, and also with other programs, obviously. So basically, it repeats infinitely until you die or then stop using a service, for example. So if you then use something, it basically is also kind of in your possession, in the things you use, and therefore there is probably a decision process behind it. Maybe if you have been using Lightroom for the last 10 years, why did you use Lightroom? Why not Photoshop? Or why not something else? Why did you even come up with editing your pictures and so on and so forth? Everything you do is probably a decision you at some point made. And you consider all the different variables that you could consider at this point in time, and therefore it's the best approximation to the decision to the best decision you could possibly make. And therefore there might be something interesting in there that is also worth sharing with other people. Recent read books. Again, this is just basically a subset of your thinking, and your thinking might be influenced by things you consume. So therefore, out of all the different things you can consume, maybe it's a series, so something that again over time releases similar types of content, like a blog, for example, or a newspaper. Maybe it is kind of a single, what I call a single, which is usually one entry that doesn't have consecutive things that are scheduled over time, like a book, for example. Let's write a book. Or it might also be something that is maybe a scientific paper. A scientific paper on the spectrum of something that is released again and again, like a TV series until it ends, or a book that could also obviously have multiple entries, but these multiple entries don't have a schedule. That's what I'm trying to say. And you cannot therefore predict when something is going to come out. So maybe a Marvel movie now comes out every 2 years, therefore on the spectrum of series to film, which obviously also is a single, then it's moving more towards the series idea. But again, this is just a spectrum, and therefore it can be something, a piece of content or product and so on and so forth, can be on both sides. Obviously, this also now applies to subscriptions. Again, a subscription is basically more on the serious side of being a product, and the other one is a single purchase. So it's either one or many. That's what I'm trying to say. Or also zero. So out of these all different content ideas, what it could go through is your read books, your recently watched movies or documentaries, the papers maybe you recently read, also maybe just WhatsApp chats or something like this you recently read. But this is more on what I focused on for now, at least, was more on the side of things that are basically media and not so much social media or your own private media, you could say. Now, when something appears on the internet, this can be a book, but usually books are published as books. at least till now, and books aren't published as blog posts yet. And if they are, then they are more on the side of being considered as blog posts. So therefore, if there is something on the internet, maybe you could see a Wikipedia entry, for example, more on the side of being a book, because sometimes they are also as long as books. So now if you have something like this, a Wikipedia entry, you can save them if it's on the web. So there are different things you can do in order to save things on the web, and one of these services is called Pocket. So therefore, whenever now I have something interesting I want to store in basically my knowledge vault of at least all the things I can access over the internet without putting in login information, I then can click on this button on the side of my browser bar and it saves the entire page. So you can also potentially use this to save YouTube videos. What I've used for YouTube videos or other videos in general is usually playlists on the account itself, but this obviously has the downside that now your recommendations are also individualized, which I try to avoid because this means that I am less influenced by these algorithms, and therefore, since I am not good, and I would argue many are not good, and these algorithms are designed to be good and to therefore constantly feed you with new content, which can be good in the short term, but probably in the mid and long term has potential downsides you want to avoid. For this reason, I do not have playlists anymore, or at least I don't access them because I try to not log in to these accounts anymore. For this reason, I still use Pocket, not to store video ideas. Sometimes I actually write watch lists. So if there's something I need to research and I need to research on YouTube, then I write it into a list that I actually then watch. For this reason, I don't have videos in Pocket, but Wikipedia articles, for example, articles from the internet, from newspapers that now also publish to the internet, can all be saved into Pocket. I do not have an existing integration from Pocket to OneNote or to Notion, for example. There just hasn't been something that has been working over time consistently. If it is then in Pocket, what you can do is you can again listen to it. So there is an audio engine built in, but you can also access it because it's a cloud service on your phone or on any device, which is very nice because it is basically a curated version of all the things you read basically, or you want to read. My bookmarks. So browser bookmarks obviously previously kind of had a similar function to Pocket, but now I think they don't anymore. So what I use bookmarks for is whenever I need to store a page that I, again, over time need to access again. Whenever I just need the information, actually, I store it as Pocket. And for example, if you look something up like the opening times of something, it might not make sense to have this in your Pocket because Pocket is something that can be consumed. This is what I'm trying to think of. And the other thing is more information-based, where you just access the information, like the opening times of a library. It doesn't make sense really to store them in here, in your Pocket, because then if you just listen to the curated playlist, so there is a functionality where you just have basically an auto playlist, and then it just plays all the content you Pocket saved. And if you then have the opening times of your local library in there, then this just might not be very relevant to you at this point in time. Historic and current habits. What is a habit? A habit is basically a very short-term task, and the term for a task, the temporal term for the task is, or the unit for the task is the day. Usually that is referred to as habits, or these are referred to as daily habits. So on the spectrum of tasks being repeated once or an infinite amount of times until you die in a certain interval or frequency, every task falls within the spectrum basically. If 0 is maybe here, but if something is 0, then it is not really a task you have to consider because the importance is 0. So therefore, on this spectrum, one could argue that things you do once are usually referred to as tasks, and things you do infinitely are usually referred to as habits. So now the question is just at which time frame you need to solve these again and again, and which time frame they occur. Examples. Usually I brush my teeth not once a day, but twice or even 3 times a day. So therefore it's more on the habit side, but it's not a daily habit since I do it multiple times a day. But it also is a daily habit if I do it once in a given day. So I do it once, but I do it usually more times than once, and it also usually is required more times than once. So the ideal frequency is more times than once in a given day. So therefore it's not really a daily habit that ideally should be done once in a given day. If it is done once in a given day, then you can consider it as a daily habit. Otherwise, it is something that either has an infinite amount of benefits to doing it multiple times, like writing, like working for an hour, for example. Of course, you cannot do it infinitely often in a given day, but if you work for an hour and make 25, 10, 50, depending obviously on your wage, multiple times and earn this amount of money, then what you can do is if you repeat this process again and again, then you get an additional benefit that is basically almost equal in terms of the importance or relevance. For this reason now, it doesn't make sense, for example, to brush your teeth 10 times a day, because if this is the utility you get out of something and this is the amount of times you do something, then or let's just put it the other way around, then as you do something multiple times, so this is frequency 1, 2, 3, as you do something multiple times, there is eventually kind of a trade-off. And if you brush your teeth more than once a day, so if you continue basically to increase the number of teeth brushings in a given day, then the importance of the accumulated thing now goes down basically. Maybe like this. So basically the optimum is at 2 times a day, but not less and not more. So what I'm trying to say here is, going back to habits, I track my habits. So basically I track my repeating tasks in 2 different task managers. The first one is a habit tracker and the second one is a task manager. Now, what I put into my task manager and what I put into my habit manager is sometimes up for debate, because these 2 are basically the same thing, just in a different frequency. But what I usually refer to is a task is something that has to be done once. And what I refer to as code, because habits kind of have this association with daily habits, even though they often aren't, is something I call code, because it's basically code. It's a program you write for yourself. And then you just execute this program, ideally, just like a robot. Because if you introduce more decision variables, then this only ends up with less efficiency, because you then have to constantly consult all of these different decision variables. For example, if you came up with your perfect nutritional plan, but then you also try to introduce these decision variables of how hungry am I, how likely is I, or what is the cheapest at a grocery store, or which advertisement did I see recently. If you then have to encounter all of these different decision variables, then the decision itself becomes more complex, and at a given set of willpower and processing power, you therefore are less likely to therefore have the optimal decision or make the optimal decision. For this reason, therefore, you are probably best off to just do the thing that you plan to do, because this also means that you then have a predictive quality of 100%, or close to 100%, at least from the factors you can control, from the variables you can control. What this results in is you being able to make plans and then just do them, and then just make plans again and do them. But if you don't have this power of making plans and then executing them actually, you're robbing yourself basically of being able to execute these and being able to therefore predict what you actually do in the future if you make any given plan. So what I'm trying to say is, within my task manager, which is Microsoft To Do, I usually record tasks I have to do once. But what I also do is, I also record tasks in here that have a need for basically additional information that can be checked off. So, for example, if I have something like filming daily, then I actually have a task in my task manager that I actually have open, more or less right now, that has the different steps that are required, which I can't have in my task manager, which is currently not a service, a cloud service, but is only present on my phone, which is a big downside, but I haven't found a better solution yet. So what I have here is film for 1 hour short videos basically. And the first step is to turn on my microphone, then check the microphone level and so on and so forth. And this is basically a checklist that I need to access over time whenever I need to do the task. And since it is a task that is repeating, but it also is a task that requires additional information that I cannot just put into this here, even though it might make sense because code are the things that are repeated again. In the program, of course, only has necessity if writing a very articulate program only makes sense if, and therefore also optimizing all the different sub-steps, only makes sense if it has something that is repeated, because if it only needs to be done once, then it doesn't really matter if the process is completely optimized up to the limit, because if you only do it once, then you obviously only do it once, and therefore you never have to think about this problem again. But then, of course, the more similar different tasks get, the more you can, again, maybe turn it into a program, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the distinction I have, and so therefore I could talk about the code. So basically, maybe I try to sleep 6 hours a day, and every time I sleep 6, 7, 8 hours a day, depending on what you actually choose, then you can just check off this habit. Whenever you try to be vegetarian, for example, or whenever you try to do anything and can be tracked on a daily basis, such as, okay, I might need to speak to more people, for example. Did I speak to one new person that I didn't know before at this given day? If yes, then check off this habit. If no, then don't check off this habit. And as you also probably associate some kind of dopamine release with this over time, it might just motivate you a little bit more to actually do this. And therefore, it might make sense to discuss these two things, because these two things are basically what you do in your life. It's the things you do again and again, and it's the things you do once. But these two things, your task manager and also your habit, so basically your tasks and your habits, are the things your life consists out of. Therefore, speaking about these individual items on this list is, again, just a very good indicator of what you actually are doing and what might be worth sharing. Now there is an additional layer to this, which I call rules. So rules are things you cannot really check off on a daily basis, but what I often realize is that maybe you can. So let's say you try to be a better person. Then being a better person is not something you can grasp. Therefore, what you could do is you could turn this into 10 sub-steps. And these top 10 sub-steps are 10 individual habits. What you also can come up with is then a list of all the habits you ideally want to do in an ideal day. And therefore, the more of these you are able to check off in a given day, the better your score of this given day is. And since, of course, you can completely adjust all of these different things, but what you also need to consider, maybe if you try to compare yourself then over time to the different scores, then what you might consider is that you want to have a ratio. Because if over time you have more and more habits, of course, then you cannot compare yourself to 10 years ago, where you had half of the habits. Therefore, the ratio of how many habits did you achieve or check off compared to all the habits that existed for this given day at this point in time might make sense. And this again is just maybe 10%, maybe 90%, because it's a ratio. It has been standardized, unionized to 1, and therefore is also a percentage, because 1 equals 100%, and so on and so forth. And the fractions of 1 equal the percentages of 1 usually get by multiplying it obviously by 100, if that was not clear. Now rules are something that nevertheless are something that is more abstract that maybe has not been converted into actual code yet. So therefore a rule might be treat others with respect. And then you can also maybe just guess if you treated others like respect and have the individual sub-analysis steps, you could say, just calculated in your head. So did I treat others with respect in a given day? Of course, it might actually materialize in what you actually did to a person, or how you treated a person in a given day, or all the different persons, and therefore is a function of all the different things you did and so on and so forth. But what you also could do is, until maybe you have 1,000 habits, what you could do until this, you could just write it down as try to be nice to people, for example. And therefore, these rules are maybe also worth talking about. Also changes in these rules, obviously. Currently studying at university. So if you are studying at university, then this might be something that it is worth talking about, because it already consumes a huge part of your mind and so on and so forth. In general, I think this is indicative of a broader concept, which is that your life already has several subcategories. One subcategory might be health. So has there been something interesting been happening regarding your health or your health optimization? One might be learning something. And if you learn something new already, you might already record it, and so on and so forth. One might be work. Has there something been interesting that is worth sharing or you can talk about? And another thing might be your social life, for example. Of course, you have to decide for yourself what parts of all of this you want to share, but if you decide to share it, then you can just look into the different parts of your life or the different categories of your life, and then potentially share these and use these as content sources. What I additionally use to store articles is in Wikipedia. I also have an account where I store just Wikipedia articles. I sometimes store them in Pocket, I sometimes store them in Wikipedia, and therefore going through Wikipedia articles is kind of a how much of Wikipedia have I, at least to some extent, read? And since this is basically explaining everything in existence, at least as of now, and basically is a public knowledge place, you could say, then how many Wikipedia articles you have stored might also be something worth tracking on your own, but at least for me, I haven't found a distinction that actually makes sense between Pocket, what I store in Pocket, and what I store as Wikipedia articles. Now, of course, I'm using Wikipedia kind of as a proxy for all the different dictionaries, not as a proxy, but I'm just choosing it as the one that is accessible and seemingly one of the best ones, more and more. Covering read papers is also in here. Studies, basically, but I did not read that many studies until now, so therefore this is kind of a future thing. Then, camera screenshots is on here, I already have this. Then, recent phone images also, basically a duplicate schedule. This is also not interesting. In total, you live your life as you live your life, usually over time, you age and so on and so forth. As you live your life, you have thoughts, you see things, you have other sensory information. You then can record in one way or another. Maybe it's a thought that can be described as something abstract, an experience, a realization, a learning, something you did, something you worked for, and so on and so forth. All of these different things might be interesting to others, which is the reason you might already tell it to your friends, to your wife, to your partner, to your friend, and so on and so forth. So what you could do is, instead of telling these things just one person or multiple people, maybe it's your family, for example, what you could do is you could just try to tell it to all the other people that are potentially interested in, if this is something you want to do. Of course, also if you have an urge in you that, or maybe if you just have a lack of confirmation bias from others, or not really from confirmation bias, but from the dopamine you get by you recording something and then others watching this, either passively already confirming and basically maybe not canceling you for saying something like this, or also just maybe getting positive feedback, which of course is nice and then confirms you in your worldview, and then means you don't have to learn new things. But of course, this is just kind of sarcastically playing up the downside of something like this. It makes sense to record what you think, what you see, and so on and so forth in different services and different cloud-based solutions. One of these is maybe your task manager, one of these is maybe your camera roll, and so on and so forth. As you record all of these different things, therefore you can then access all of these different documentation services, you could also call them, or capture services, and therefore, since these then are curated by you over time already, you can just access them again and maybe access them for video ideas or for, in general, content ideas.